For years, Gene Hackman's mansion stood in near total silence, hidden behind layers of privacy that matched the actor's own withdrawal from public life. While the world remembered him as one of Hollywood's most formidable screen presences, few knew anything about how he lived after stepping away from fame. That silence, however, ended the moment the doors of his estate were finally opened. What began as a routine legal process quickly turned into something far more unsettling. Those who entered the mansion for the first time expected to find a quiet retreat, tasteful, minimal, and reflective of a man known for discipline and restraint. Instead, they were met with an atmosphere that felt heavy, deliberate, and strangely frozen in time. The house did not feel abandoned, but paused, as if its owner had only just stepped out and might return at any moment. Rooms were impeccably maintained, yet rarely used. Furniture showed little wear. Clocks were stopped. Several areas of the house were sealed off entirely, their doors locked and labeled with handwritten notes that offered no explanation. Even seasoned professionals admitted there was an immediate sense that this was not merely a home, it was a controlled environment. What shocked them most was how intentionally inaccessible everything was. Unlike typical celebrity estates filled with memorabilia and open displays of success, Hackman's mansion seemed designed to erase his public identity. Awards were nowhere to be seen. There were no framed posters, no red carpet photographs, no visible reminders of Hollywood glory. It was as if the man who lived here had been actively dismantling his own legend. As they moved deeper into the house, it became clear that this isolation was not accidental. Security systems, many outdated but carefully preserved, lined hidden corridors. Certain rooms were shielded with soundproofing. Others had reinforced walls. Nothing appeared impulsive. Every architectural choice suggested foresight, planning, and an intense desire for privacy. Gene Hackman had always been known as fiercely private, but this went beyond discretion. This was separation. One insider later described the experience as walking into someone's mind rather than their home. The mansion reflected a life lived inward, away from scrutiny, away from interpretation. And yet, there was no chaos. No signs of decline or disorder. Everything was structured, catalogued, and maintained with near military precision. What unsettled observers was the contradiction. Hackman had left Hollywood quietly, without scandal, explanation, or farewell tour. Publicly, it seemed like a peaceful retirement. Privately, however, the mansion suggested something more deliberate, a slow, calculated disengagement from the world itself. As preliminary reviews continued, whispers began to circulate. There were rumors of sealed rooms, personal archives, and materials never meant to be seen. Some speculated about secrets. Others suspected paranoia. But those inside the mansion quickly realized the truth would be far more complex, and far more human, than any rumor. This was not the home of a man hiding from guilt. It was the fortress of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched, and who finally decided he had been seen enough. And as the first locked door was prepared to be opened, one thing became clear: whatever they were about to find inside Gene Hackman's mansion would permanently change how the world understood his disappearance from public life. What stunned investigators and close associates most was not the size of Gene Hackman's mansion, nor its secluded elegance, but the number of rooms that had remained locked and untouched for decades. According to those familiar with the property, several wings of the house were rarely entered, even by staff. When those doors were finally opened, what they revealed added a chilling layer to the mystery surrounding the legendary actor's private life. Inside one room, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed tightly with handwritten journals. Not scripts. Not memoir drafts. Journals. Hundreds of them. Each was dated, meticulously labeled, and written entirely in Hackman's unmistakable, disciplined handwriting. The entries reportedly spanned more than 40 years, beginning shortly after his rise to fame in the early 1970s. What unsettled readers was not their existence, but their tone. Rather than glamour or Hollywood triumphs, the journals were described as intensely introspective, even bleak. Hackman wrote repeatedly about isolation, distrust of the industry, and a deep discomfort with fame. He documented moments of paranoia, fear of betrayal, and an obsessive need for control over his environment. One insider described the writing as brilliant but deeply unsettling, revealing a man who never felt safe, no matter how successful he became. In another locked room, they found walls covered in photographs, clippings, and handwritten notes pinned together in complex patterns. At first glance, it resembled the workspace of a detective or investigator. Many of the clippings were about Hackman himself, interviews, reviews, gossip columns, and even harsh criticisms long forgotten by the public. Certain names were circled repeatedly, connected by red lines and notes scribbled in the margins. What shocked observers was the implication that Hackman obsessively tracked how he was perceived and who he believed had wronged or misunderstood him. Former acquaintances claimed he kept mental scorecards, and this room seemed to confirm it. The actor who appeared confident and commanding on screen may have been quietly battling insecurity and resentment behind closed doors. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a soundproofed room in the lower level of the mansion. Sparse and cold, it contained little more than a chair, a desk, and an old tape recorder. Boxes of cassette tapes were stacked neatly along one wall. Each tape was labeled with a date and, sometimes, a single word: anger, fear, regret. When a few of these recordings were reviewed by those legally permitted to do so, they reportedly contained Hackman speaking directly into the recorder, sometimes calmly, sometimes shouting, sometimes falling into long, heavy silences. He spoke about roles he hated, people he never forgave, and a recurring theme of wanting to disappear entirely from public life. It was not illegal, but it was haunting. Friends later admitted that Hackman had always feared losing control of his narrative. He believed Hollywood devoured people, reshaped them, and discarded what was left. These recordings appeared to be his private therapy, a way to release emotions he never allowed himself to show in public. Adding to the unease was a collection of personal letters that were never sent. Many were addressed to fellow actors, directors, and even family members. Some expressed gratitude, others bitterness, and a few carried an unmistakable finality, as if written during moments when Hackman believed he might vanish forever. None were mailed. All were sealed, preserved, and hidden away. What made these findings so shocking was the contrast. To the world, Gene Hackman was the embodiment of control, disciplined, selective, and famously private. Yet within the walls of his mansion existed a parallel life filled with emotional turbulence, obsessive self-reflection, and unresolved inner conflict. By the time the doors were closed again, one conclusion became unavoidable. The mansion was not merely a home. It was a fortress. A vault. A silent witness to decades of internal battles that Hackman never shared with the public. And as more details slowly surfaced, one question lingered heavily in the air: if this was only part of what they found, what truths did Gene Hackman ensure would never be discovered at all? As the deeper inventory of Gene Hackman's mansion continued, those involved began to notice patterns that were impossible to ignore. The discoveries from the locked rooms no longer felt random or merely eccentric. Instead, they painted the outline of a man who had been preparing, quietly and methodically, for a complete withdrawal from the world long before he officially stepped away from Hollywood. One of the most unsettling findings was a series of detailed floor plans of the mansion itself. These were not original blueprints but hand-altered diagrams, updated repeatedly over the years. Certain rooms were crossed out. Others were reinforced with handwritten notes such as secure, isolated, and no access. Several exits appeared to have been intentionally removed or sealed, according to annotations made in Hackman's handwriting. To many, it suggested an obsessive need to control every physical aspect of his environment. Alongside the plans were documents outlining daily routines, broken down to the minute. Wake times, meal schedules, exercise periods, writing sessions, and isolation hours were rigidly planned. Even phone calls were scheduled and limited. The margins of these pages revealed frustration whenever routines were broken, with phrases like lost focus, breach, and too exposed appearing again and again. Friends later recalled that Hackman grew increasingly intolerant of surprises as he aged. Another room revealed a locked cabinet containing surveillance equipment, outdated but carefully maintained. Old security monitors, motion sensors, and audio devices had once been active throughout the property. Records suggested that Hackman personally reviewed logs and footage, sometimes late into the night. While none of this was illegal, the extent of the monitoring shocked those who had known him as merely private rather than hypervigilant. What disturbed many observers most was a collection of personal rules, typed and revised multiple times, titled simply, "Conditions for Peace." These pages read less like self-help guidance and more like survival protocols. Hackman outlined what he believed was necessary to remain mentally intact: 0 unannounced visitors, minimal press exposure, controlled communication, and complete autonomy over his time. Perhaps the most emotionally revealing discovery came in the form of annotated film scripts from his most iconic roles. Hackman had gone back years later, writing notes in the margins not about performance, but about how each role had cost him something personal. He described certain films as emotionally corrosive and others as necessary sacrifices. One annotation read simply, "This is where I lost myself." There were also folders marked with the names of former collaborators. Inside were brief summaries, some respectful, others cutting. In a few cases, Hackman speculated about motives, betrayals, or imagined slights. Whether these perceptions were grounded in reality or shaped by years of isolation remained unclear, but the emotional weight behind them was undeniable. The mansion, once thought to be a peaceful retreat, now appeared to be a carefully engineered cocoon. Every object, document, and room served a singular purpose: control. Control of space. Control of time. Control of narrative. Control of self. Those who reviewed the materials later described a growing sense of sadness rather than fear. Hackman did not appear dangerous or delusional. He appeared exhausted. A man who had given too much of himself to an industry that never truly let him go, and who responded by slowly retreating behind layers of security, structure, and silence. By the end of the third phase of discoveries, one truth became clear. Gene Hackman did not simply retire. He withdrew, deliberately, systematically, and completely. And the mansion was not just where he lived out his later years. It was where he disappeared. But as investigators prepared to conclude their review, they uncovered one final category of items that suggested Hackman had been planning for something far more permanent, something he never intended the world to fully understand. What emerged next from Gene Hackman's mansion shifted the narrative from introspection to intention. Until this point, everything uncovered could be explained as the coping mechanisms of an intensely private man. But the documents and objects found in the final secured areas suggested long-term planning that went far beyond solitude or retirement. Hidden inside a fireproof safe were multiple versions of legal and financial documents, meticulously organized and updated over decades. Wills, trusts, property transfers, and contingency instructions were revised again and again, sometimes only months apart. What struck experts immediately was not the presence of these documents, but their specificity. Hackman had anticipated nearly every conceivable scenario: illness, incapacity, media intrusion, unauthorized biographies, and even the handling of personal effects should his privacy be violated after death. Several clauses focused explicitly on suppression. Personal journals were to be sealed for a fixed number of years. Audio recordings were restricted to private review only, never public release. Certain rooms of the mansion were to be dismantled entirely, their contents destroyed or dispersed anonymously. The language was firm, almost clinical, revealing a man determined to erase his inner life from public consumption. Equally unsettling was a series of correspondence drafts addressed to attorneys and executors, none of which were ever sent. In these letters, Hackman expressed distrust, not just of the media, but of human curiosity itself. He wrote that people confuse access with entitlement and warned that the truth of a person's inner world could be easily distorted into spectacle. One passage stated bluntly, "I refuse to become a posthumous character." In another sealed container, they discovered passports, some expired, others still valid at the time of his complete withdrawal from public life. Alongside them were handwritten notes outlining possible alternative residences, listed only by coordinates and climate conditions rather than addresses. Though there was no evidence he ever used them, the implication was chilling. Hackman wanted the option to vanish entirely if necessary. There were also emergency plans. Detailed instructions explained how staff should be dismissed quietly, how communications should be severed, and how public appearances could be minimized without raising suspicion. It read less like paranoia and more like a strategic exit plan, drafted by someone who understood fame as a permanent threat rather than a privilege. Perhaps most haunting was a small envelope labeled simply, "If I change my mind." Inside was a single page, handwritten and deeply personal. Hackman acknowledged that his need for control might one day outweigh his humanity. He wrote about the danger of isolation, the risk of becoming unreachable, and the possibility that he might disappear too well. It was the first document found that showed doubt rather than certainty. Those closest to the situation later admitted that this discovery altered how they viewed Hackman's final years. He was not running from scandal, crime, or guilt. He was running from exposure. From misinterpretation. From a world that had watched him for decades and would never stop asking for more. By the end of Part 4, the conclusion was unavoidable. Gene Hackman's withdrawal was not passive. It was engineered. Every layer of his life was designed to reduce visibility, limit access, and protect a version of himself that he believed the world had no right to see. Yet, as comprehensive as his plans were, one final contradiction remained, an object that suggested Hackman may have secretly wanted someone, someday, to understand the truth he worked so hard to conceal. Among all the documents, security measures, and carefully structured exit plans, one discovery inside Gene Hackman's mansion stood apart from the rest. It contradicted everything he appeared to believe about privacy, control, and disappearance. And because of that, it unsettled those who found it more than anything else. Tucked away in a modest wooden box, unlocked, unmarked, and almost carelessly placed, was a collection of deeply personal items that Hackman had made no attempt to secure or suppress. Unlike the journals and tapes, these objects were not hidden behind locks or legal restrictions. They were accessible, as if meant to be found. Inside were photographs that had never been published or even catalogued. They showed Hackman not as a Hollywood icon, but as a quiet, ordinary man. There were candid images of him cooking alone, walking deserted roads at sunrise, sitting in silence with a notebook he wasn't writing in. In several photos, he appeared older than his years, visibly tired, but strangely at peace. What struck observers immediately was the absence of performance. These were not moments curated for memory or legacy. They were raw, unguarded glimpses of a man at rest with himself, something few believed Hackman ever allowed. Beneath the photographs lay a slim notebook, different from the others found throughout the house. This one contained no dates. No structure. No obsessive order. Instead, it read like a quiet conversation with no audience in mind. The tone was softer, reflective, and unexpectedly vulnerable. In its pages, Hackman wrote about aging without applause, about learning to be uninteresting again, and about the relief of no longer being watched. He admitted that much of his life had been spent bracing himself against critics, expectations, and the fear of becoming irrelevant. Yet here, for the first time, he framed irrelevance not as loss, but as freedom. One passage stood out to everyone who read it: "I don't want to be remembered accurately. I want to be remembered gently." It was a sentiment that directly opposed the defensive measures he had built around himself, suggesting an internal conflict he never resolved. There were also letters, this time clearly intended to be read. Unlike the sealed and unsent correspondence discovered earlier, these were addressed simply to whoever finds this. In them, Hackman acknowledged his contradictions. He wrote that control had protected him, but it had also cost him closeness. That silence had given him peace, but also loneliness. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he justify his withdrawal. Instead, he offered context. He described fame as a long-term erosion rather than a single trauma, something that slowly reshaped his instincts until retreat felt like survival. Perhaps the most powerful revelation came at the end of the final letter. Hackman wrote that if someone was reading his words, then his disappearance had not been total, and that maybe it wasn't meant to be. He accepted that understanding does not require exposure, and that mystery does not always equal deceit. This small wooden box changed how everything else was interpreted. The fortress, the surveillance, the sealed journals, all of it had been built to keep the world out. But this one collection suggested that Hackman still believed in connection, however limited and delayed it might be. He had not hidden everything. And in that quiet contradiction, the image of Gene Hackman shifted once again, from a man obsessed with vanishing, to one who simply wanted to be seen on his own terms. By the time the final materials from Gene Hackman's mansion were reviewed, the narrative that emerged was far more complex than anyone anticipated. What began as a shocking discovery evolved into a deeply human story, one that forced those involved to reconsider not only Hackman's withdrawal from public life, but the very idea of legacy itself. What became clear in Part 6 was that Hackman was not trying to control how the world would remember him. He was trying to control how much of himself the world was allowed to take. Experts who examined the contents noted a recurring theme across every room, document, and recording: exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion alone, but emotional fatigue built over decades of being interpreted, judged, and repackaged by others. Hackman had reached a point where protecting his inner life mattered more than preserving his public image. One particularly revealing audio recording, dated just a few years after his official retirement, captured Hackman reflecting on the concept of fame with striking clarity. He said that people believed actors lived many lives, but in reality, they lived none of their own. Every emotion was rehearsed, every silence analyzed. Stepping away, he explained, was not an escape from work, it was a return to authenticity. This reframed the more disturbing discoveries. The surveillance systems were not about fear of others, but fear of intrusion. The rigid schedules were not signs of obsession, but scaffolding to support a fragile sense of peace. The sealed journals were not secrets to be hidden forever, but boundaries drawn too late. Even the planning for disappearance now appeared less like paranoia and more like self-preservation. Hackman understood something few celebrities openly admit: once a public figure loses control of their narrative, they never get it back. He refused to let his final chapter be written by speculation, sensationalism, or strangers. Those who had once described him as cold or distant began to reconsider. Hackman had not withdrawn because he lacked empathy, but because he felt too much of it. Absorbing expectations, criticisms, and projections had become unbearable. Silence, in his case, was not indifference, it was mercy, both for himself and for others. Perhaps the most profound realization came from comparing the secured documents with the open wooden box discovered earlier. The contrast was deliberate. Hackman had divided his life into two truths, the one that needed protection, and the one that could be shared. He understood that complete transparency destroys meaning, but complete secrecy erases connection. In the end, the mansion was not a place of darkness. It was a final statement. A refusal to let fame consume the last remaining parts of his humanity. Hackman did not vanish out of bitterness or fear. He stepped away because he believed that a life observed too closely eventually stops being lived. As the findings were quietly sealed and the property prepared for its next chapter, one final consensus emerged among those who had seen everything. Gene Hackman's greatest performance was not on screen. It was the life he designed after the camera stopped rolling. And for the first time, the world began to understand that his silence was never an absence, it was a boundary. When the last door of Gene Hackman's mansion was finally closed, those who had witnessed its contents understood that the shock was never about scandal, crime, or dark secrets in the conventional sense. What left people truly stunned was something far rarer: clarity. For decades, Gene Hackman had been described as elusive, difficult, even cold. His refusal to participate in Hollywood nostalgia, interviews, or public reinvention had fueled endless speculation. Many assumed bitterness. Others suspected arrogance. But the truth revealed inside the mansion dismantled those assumptions completely. Hackman had not rejected the world. He had protected himself from it. What they found was not evidence of a man hiding something shameful, but of a man who understood the cost of being endlessly accessible. Every journal, recording, and rule pointed to the same conclusion: fame had taken more than it gave, and retreat was the only way to reclaim ownership of his inner life. In an industry that rewards constant visibility, Hackman's greatest act of defiance was choosing invisibility. He refused to explain himself, knowing that explanations invite interpretation, and interpretation invites distortion. Instead, he left behind structure, boundaries, and a quiet trail of truth for those willing to look beyond headlines. The most powerful revelation was not what he concealed, but what he allowed to remain discoverable. The photographs. The open letters. The unguarded reflections. These were not accidents. They were reminders that a person can be both private and sincere, guarded and honest. Hackman understood something that many never do: legacy is not built by exposure alone. Sometimes, it is shaped by restraint. By controlling his exit so carefully, he forced the world to confront an uncomfortable idea: that constant access to public figures has eroded empathy. That curiosity often disguises entitlement. And that silence does not automatically mean guilt, fear, or emptiness. In the end, the mansion told a single, cohesive story. Not of paranoia. Not of isolation. But of intention. Gene Hackman did not disappear because he had something to hide. He disappeared because he had already given enough. And that is why what they found inside his mansion left so many people shocked, not because it revealed a darker version of the man they thought they knew, but because it revealed a truth Hollywood rarely allows. Sometimes, the bravest thing a legend can do is walk away quietly, on his own terms.